The fog came off the river before sunrise and settled into the western coppice like something poured rather than blown, thick enough that the men counting stumps had to work by feel as much as sight. Their breath joined the mist. Their boots left dark punctuation marks in the frosted grass. There were 3 of them, and 1 old survey map, and neither agreed with the other. "Count again," said the eldest, a bailiff's man with a lantern that did little against the white weight of the air. "Count from the hedge line this time." They counted again. The number came out the same as before, which was the trouble, not that it varied, but that it held steady at a figure the map refused to permit. The map, drawn in a careful hand some 10 years past, recorded 412 mature ash and oak standing in that particular quarter of coppice. The stumps on the ground, blackened with age and weather, numbered 461. 49 trees, too many, had apparently vanished from a wood that, according to the estate's own paper, had never held them. "That can't be right," the youngest of the men said, not for the first time. No one answered him. The lantern swung. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a dog began barking at nothing, or at something none of them could see in the fog, and then fell silent again, as if it too had thought better of drawing attention. They knew, without saying it aloud, that this was not a matter for men counting stumps in the cold. It was a matter for the counting house, for the ledgers, for the long column of years that no one at Rendell Hall had been permitted to examine too closely. 10 winters of felled timber, floated down river to market, sold under a steward's signature, and never once questioned by the uncle who had, in his final years, grown too tired and too trusting to ask why the western coppice yielded so little coin for so much wood. The old survey map would not answer for it. Paper never does. But somewhere in the house behind them, past the stable yard, past the kitchen garden's frost-rimed walls, up the narrow stair to a room where a woman of ordinary dress sat each morning with ink-stained fingers and a patience no one troubled to notice, there existed 18 ledgers, bound in cracked brown leather, that would. She did not yet know that the fog had settled over the coppice that morning, nor that 3 men had stood counting stumps against a map that lied by 49 trees. She knew only that the new master of the house, a colonel some 2 months returned from the continent with a cane and a silence sharper than any shout, had sent word the previous evening that the steward was to attend him in the estate office at 9 o'clock, to account, in full, and to the shilling, for a decade of vanishing timber money. The fog would lift by then, the numbers would not. 8 weeks earlier, the fog had lain over Rendell Hall in much the same way, thick and unhurried, as though the weather itself were reluctant to admit that anything had changed. The old Duke had died on a Tuesday in October, quietly, in the same bed his father had died in, and the news reached the servants' hall before it reached the family solicitor, as such news always does. The underclerk had been at her desk when she heard it, not from any messenger, but from the particular hush that fell over the house, a silence with weight to it, the kind that follows a clock stopping. She had gone on with the ledgers that morning. There had seemed nothing else to do. The new master did not come for 11 days. When word arrived that he would, the household turned itself out in the drive like a regiment awaiting inspection. The housekeeper in her good gray wool, the footman brushed and buttoned, the steward standing at the front with his watch chain gleaming, and his face arranged into the particular blend of grief and welcome that men of his sort kept pressed and ready for such occasions. The carriage came up the avenue slowly, wheels grinding on wet gravel, and when it stopped, there was a pause before the door opened, long enough that the housekeeper glanced sideways, long enough that the underclerk, standing near the back where clerks are meant to stand, noticed it too. He came down awkwardly, favoring the left leg, one hand finding the door frame before the cane found the ground. He was younger than the house had expected, and harder looking than his uncle had ever been, his face weathered in the particular way of men who have spent years being shot at rather than being obeyed. He did not smile at the assembled staff. He looked at them the way a man looks at a ledger he suspects has been altered, carefully and without warmth. "Which of you is the steward?" he said, and it was not truly a question, because the steward had already stepped forward, hat in hand, murmuring some rehearsed sentiment about the late Duke's peace and the honor of the house. The colonel let him finish. Then he said, "The accounts will want reviewing, and nothing more," and turned toward the doors before anyone could answer him, his cane striking the stone with a sound too even to be called a limp, and too uneven to be called anything else. The underclerk watched him go. She noted, without quite meaning to, that his eyes had passed over the assembled staff exactly once, cataloging them the way a man catalogues inventory, the housekeeper, the footman, the steward, and had not paused on her at all. She was, that first afternoon, precisely what 6 years had made her. Unremarked, unnamed, and standing very still near the back of the drive, where the fog was thickest, and no one thought to look. The counting-house at Rendell Hall had never been built for comfort, and 10 years of habit had taught her not to expect it. The floor was slate, laid sometime in the last century by a mason who had not troubled himself with levelness, so that the legs of her chair rocked faintly whenever she leaned to dip her pen. In winter, the cold came up through her shoes, like water through a hull. In summer, it did not warm so much as dampen, and the paper curled at its edges from the moisture that crept in beneath the door. She lit her candle before the rest of the house had finished its breakfast, because the counting-house had one window, small and north-facing, and by 9 o'clock in autumn, the light through it was already thin as broth. The candle guttered in the draught from the chimney flue. The flue drew poorly, always had, and the steward had never seen fit to have it seen too, since it was her draught to suffer, not his, and she had learned to angle her hand so the shadow did not fall across the column she was totaling. Around her, in stacks that had grown taller than was proper for any single room, stood the towers of paper that made up the estate's public face, receipts for seed and lime, wages for the underkeepers, accounts for the stable and the home farm, all copied in a fair, careful hand that was not the steward's own, though his name went beneath every total in ink dark enough to suggest confidence. It was her hand. It had been her hand for 6 years. She had come to the work as a girl comes to a habit she does not choose but cannot afterward abandon, set to it first as a favor, then as a duty, then simply as the thing she did, the way another woman might set a table or mend a hem. The steward brought her the raw figures, sometimes on torn corners of paper, sometimes only spoken aloud while he stood warming himself at a fire she was not permitted to share, and she rendered them into the neat, defensible columns that satisfied auditors and aunts, and, on the rare occasions he required it, a magistrate's clerk making idle inquiry. He signed what she wrote. He was thanked for a steadiness of management that was, in every material sense, hers. She did not resent the arrangement so much as she had stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing a draft one has lived with long enough. But she had noticed, this morning, the particular way the new colonel's eyes had passed over her without pausing, not unkindly, only efficiently, the way a man's eyes pass over a chair or a hat stand, useful furniture requiring no further thought, and something in her, small and old and long quiet, had shifted at the sight of it, like a stone settling after years under water. She trimmed the candle. She opened the ledger before her, the steward's ledger, the one meant for eyes other than her own, and began, as she always did, to make his figures honest. The counting-house at Rendell Hall smelled that morning of beeswax and damp stone, the smell it had worn every quarter-day for as long as she had kept its books, and she stood where she always stood, against the far wall, beneath the map of the estate's bounds her father had once helped survey, her hands folded before her like a woman waiting to be dismissed rather than heard. The steward sat at the long table with the quarterly ledger open before him, the very pages she had ruled and totted the night before by candlelight, and across from him the new colonel sat with his cane laid crosswise over his knees, his wounded leg held at an angle that spoke of old, disciplined pain. "The coppice yield is soft this year," the steward said, "as your late uncle was informed each season, timber prices being what they are." He turned a page with the flat of his hand. a gesture of ownership so practiced she almost admired its ease. "I have kept the accounts close, Colonel. No estate in the county is run tighter." The Duke said nothing for a moment. He looked at the columns, not at the man presenting them, and something in the stillness of his attention made the steward speak faster, filling silence the way lesser men always did. "6 years I have managed these books myself," the steward went on. "Every entry my own hand, every figure verified before it reaches you. It was not, strictly, a lie that could be caught by anyone in that room but her." She watched the sentence leave him and settle over the table like dust, and she felt the old familiar closing of her throat. Not anger exactly, something flatter and more tired than anger, the particular fatigue of a fact one has carried so long it has worn a groove. She did not step forward. She had never been asked to step forward in 6 years, and the habit of stillness was by now indistinguishable from instinct. "Every entry your own hand," the Duke repeated, without inflection, and for one unbearable second she thought he meant to press the matter, to look past the steward to the wall where she stood. But his gaze only dropped again to the page, unhurried, cataloging. "The Western Coppice returns have fallen each year since 13, consistently. Trees do not grow to order, Colonel." "No," the Duke said, "they do not." He closed the ledger with 2 fingers, the sound small and final in the cold room, and rose, favoring the leg, reaching for the cane before anyone could think to offer it. "I shall want the decade's accounts, all of them, brought to the estate office by Thursday." He did not look toward the back wall on his way out, and she told herself, folding her hands tighter, that she had not expected him to. Thursday was 3 days distant, and she spent them as she had spent every year of her employment, bent over the counting-house desk while the light moved slow and grudging across the floorboards. The fire kept low because coal was dear, and the steward disliked the expense of warming a room. He entered only to sign what she had already totaled. She drew the ledgers one by one from the false bottom drawer, their brown covers cracked at the spine like the knuckles of old hands, and laid them in order by year, 1808 at the top, water-stained where a window had once leaked upon it. During a wet Michaelmas, she still remembered, for the smell of damp paper and tallow. It was in the 7th volume, the year 1814, that she paused. The felling record for the Western Coppice listed 40 cords taken in November, sold at the customary rate to the timber merchant in the market town, a Mr. Faircloth, whose receipts she had copied into the ledger herself, in her own careful hand, because the steward found the exercise beneath him. But the sum entered as received did not match the sum the felling ought to have brought, not by a shilling here or there, the kind of small arithmetic slippage a tired clerk might make at midnight, but by 11 pounds even, a round sum, too round. She sat with her pen suspended above the page a long moment, the nib drying, and told herself it might be a transcription error, hers or the merchant's, some honest confusion of accounts. She had told herself such things before. In 1811 she had found a similar roundness, 9 pounds, that time, and had gone to the steward with the ledger open to the page, her finger beneath the figure, and he had looked at her the way one looks at a clock that has struck the wrong hour, and told her that questions of that kind were not the business of an underclerk, that she would do well to enter what she was given, and leave the reckoning of it to those paid to reckon. She had entered what she was given ever since. Now she turned back through the pages, 1813, 1812, and the same roundness appeared, smaller some years, larger in others, always a sum too clean to have arrived by accident, always beside a felling in the Western Coppice, and never, she noted with a small, cold precision, beside the Eastern one. She made a mark in the margin, the mark she had learned to make years ago, a short stroke no wider than a nail paring, meaningless to any eye but her own, and only then did she allow herself to think of the Duke's voice in the cold room, unhurried, cataloguing. The Western Coppice returns have fallen each year since 13. He had not seen the ledgers yet. He had only seen the summaries the steward permitted him to see. She closed the volume and reached for the next. The counting-house had gone dark by the time she left it. The clerk's stools pushed in, the tallow candles guttered to stubs, the housekeeper's girl would scold her for wasting. She carried the ledger she had been working from, the estates, the one the steward permitted anyone to see, back to its shelf, with the same care she gave everything that was not hers, and walked the passage to the small room off the scullery stair that had been called her office for 6 years, though it was scarcely larger than a linen press. She barred the door. It was a habit so old, she no longer noticed the shame in it, the barring of a door against a household that would think nothing of walking in on an underclerk at her sums. The writing desk had belonged to her father. It was the one object of his she had kept when the surveyor's instruments and the good coat and the small collection of maps had all gone to pay what he owed 8 years before, and left her without dowry or protection, only the desk and what he had taught her of land and figures. It had a drawer that stuck on damp evenings, and a second drawer beneath it that no one but she had ever thought to test, because the fitting was so close, so ordinary, that it did not announce itself as anything but the bottom of the piece. She pressed the catch her father had shown her once, laughing, calling it a smuggler's trick, though he had never smuggled anything in his life but small kindnesses. The false bottom lifted. Inside, in a stack gone soft and rounded at the corners, lay 18 ledgers bound in cracked brown leather, each spine darkened where her thumb had worried it open 1,000 times. She had not counted them in some while. She counted them now, by touch more than sight, the candle too poor to read the years stamped faintly on the covers, 1808 at the bottom, the first months thin and uncertain, a girl of 20 learning what her father's teaching was worth in a house that did not want her opinion. Then the long climb of years pressed one atop the next, thickening as her hand steadied, until the last, 1817, not yet full, the current year waiting to be finished. She drew out the earliest. Her own writing filled the margins beside the steward's entries, dates, corrections, the small cold strokes she had made instead of speaking, because speaking had been forbidden her long before the new duke ever set foot in the cold room upstairs. She had kept these pages the way another woman might have kept letters, not from vanity, from necessity, she told herself, though she could not now say for whom the necessity had been, for the estate, for her father's memory of honest reckoning, or only for the private, stubborn proof that she had seen what she had seen. She set the first ledger open upon the desk, and began, once more, to read. The servants' hall smelled of tallow and boiled mutton when she came down for her bread and small beer, the ledger's dust still on her fingers though she had scrubbed them twice. The fire had burned low, and around it the household had gathered in that particular hour when work eased and tongues loosened, and she felt, as she always felt entering that room, the small contraction of space that happened when people who had decided a person did not signify, made room for her without truly making room at all. The housekeeper sat closest to the flame, her sharp face turned gold by it, and she looked up at the clerk's plain gray wool, the collar mended twice at the seam, the hem gone soft and colorless from years of washing, and she did not trouble to lower her voice. There she is. Come up from her burrow at last. A ripple of laughter, small, obliging, the kind offered to a woman whose good opinion mattered to one's own comfort in the house. One would think, working so close beside the steward all these years, some of his fine coat might have rubbed off on her. But no, still dressed like a farmer's daughter come to beg flour. The clerk took her bread without answering, sat where a place had been left for her, at the far end, nearest the draught under the door. She had long since learned that silence cost her nothing the housekeeper's words could not already claim. I don't say it unkindly, the housekeeper went on, working a needle through a stocking with brisk, contented strokes, only that a woman ought to know her situation, and dress to it, and not go about the house as though she has some great secret work only she understands. We all know what she is. The steward's shadow, and nothing more, whatever airs she might carry up those stairs of an evening. The other servants smiled into their cups. One of the younger maids glanced toward the clerk with something almost like pity, quickly suppressed, as pity for the truly insignificant so often is. The clerk ate her bread. She thought of the false-bottom drawer, of 18 ledgers stacked in the dark like sleeping things, of her own hand recording, year after year, what she had not been permitted to speak, and she thought that a shadow, at least, could not be blamed for what fell within its shape, only for failing to move when the light demanded it. She rose before the meal's end, as she always did, murmuring some excuse about the counting-house grate needing tending, and the housekeeper's laughter followed her to the door, bright and satisfied, certain of its target. In the passage, the cold struck her plain sleeves through, and she stood a moment with her hand upon the stone wall, steadying herself, not against the chill, but against the old, familiar ache of being looked at and not seen. An ache she had carried so long she had almost mistaken it, until lately, for the ordinary weather of her life. Above stairs, in the room that had been his uncle's study and was now, by the slow accretion of habit rather than any declaration, his own, the Duke sat with the estate's general ledger open before him, and a single branch of candles burning low. The house had gone quiet in the particular way old houses do near midnight, not silent, but settled, its beams ticking faintly as they cooled, a mouse somewhere behind the wainscot, going about its business, with more confidence than any servant would have shown in his presence. He had meant only to satisfy himself of the broad shape of the accounts before the quarter-day meeting, a duty undertaken more from the discipline of command than any real suspicion. Ledgers, after all, were not terrain to be surveyed for ambush. And yet, his finger had stopped, some minutes ago, upon a column of figures for the Western Coppice, timber sold in the autumn of the previous year, and had not moved since. The sum recorded was plausible on its face, a decent return for cordwood and bark, nothing to trouble a careless eye, but he had spent 7 years reading terrain for its lies, judging a slope by what it did not show as much as by what it did, and something in the tidiness of the entry offended him in a way he could not at first name. The other columns of the ledger bore the small imperfections of ordinary bookkeeping, a figure crossed and rewritten, a blot, an uneven hand where the writer had been tired or cold. This one entry alone was flawless, its numerals formed with the careful uniformity of a thing copied rather than calculated, as though someone had decided upon the answer before troubling with the sum. He drew the candle closer, he set his own pencil beside the column, and worked the addition through by hand, slowly, the way he had once worked range tables by lamplight, in a tent that smelled of wet canvas and gun oil, while men waited outside for numbers that would decide whether they lived. The total the ledger gave did not match the total his pencil gave. The discrepancy was not large, a matter of some pounds only, but it was exact, and exactness of that particular kind was not, in his experience, an accident. He sat back, his leg ached, as it always did in the cold hours, a dull, insistent throb along the old wound that he had long since stopped resenting and merely endured, the way one endures weather. He did not reach for the bell at once. He looked instead at the neat, false little column for some while longer, as a man looks at a fence line that does not run true, wondering less what had caused the error than who had thought him unlikely to notice it. In the morning, he told the footman, "Send for the steward, and say I wish to see the books for the coppice, all of them, going back as far as they run." The message reached the counting-house before midnight, though not by the footman's mouth. It came instead as a knock at her own door, 3 raps, too heavy to be anything but a man who had stopped caring whether he was heard. She had not yet banked the fire. The room still held its small warmth, the smell of tallow and old paper, the ledgers themselves shelved in their ordinary places along the wall, all but the 18, which lay where they always lay, in the false bottom of her desk, beneath a drawer of blotting sand and broken nibs that no one else had ever thought worth opening. He came in without waiting to be bid. His greatcoat was still damp from the yard, and his face, in the candlelight, had none of its daytime composure. The ruddiness of good living had gone gray and slack, and his eyes moved to the shelves before they moved to her. "The Western Coppice books," he said. "The recent years. I want them out." She did not rise. "They are with the others, sir, where they have always been. Don't play the innocent with me." His voice dropped, though there was no one to overhear but the two of them and the fire's small collapse in the grate. "He has sent for them, all of them," he says, "going back as far as they run. You know what that means as well as I do." "I know what is written in them," she said. "I wrote a good part of it myself." "Then you know what must be changed." He came nearer the desk, and the candle between them threw his shadow long across the ledger she had been working, so that for a moment his darkness lay directly over her hand. 2 entries. Perhaps 3. A stroke of the pen. No more. You have the hand for it. God knows. Better than mine ever was. No one will look twice. You alter them tonight, and in the morning there is nothing for him to find but an old man's untidy bookkeeping. And if I do not? He did not answer that at once. His jaw worked, and for a moment she saw beneath the bluster something closer to fright. A man totting his own accounts and finding the sum unbearable. You have done this work in silence for 6 years, he said at last, low. No one thanked you for it. No one will thank you for the other, either. Only ruin you alongside me, because who is to say, once the question is asked, that the hand that hid it and the hand that recorded it are not the same hand? She set down her pen very deliberately, so that it would not blot. Then I had better make certain, she said, that the hand that recorded it is the one that answers for it truly, and not the one that stole. The steward straightened, as though she had struck him, and for a moment the counting-house held only the sound of rain, finding some new fault in the gutter above the western window. He had expected, she understood, a different answer. Tears, perhaps, or the frightened compliance of 6 years' habit. He had not expected refusal spoken so evenly, as though she were correcting a column and not ending an arrangement that had fed them both, in its way, for a decade. You will not do it, he said, and it was not a question. No? Then you condemn us both. His voice had lost its wheedling softness entirely now. What remained was something closer to the man who had signed her wages each quarter day, without once writing her name above the sum. You think he will parse the difference between the clerk who kept the books honest in secret and the steward who did not. You think a colonel fresh from a war will trouble himself to distinguish loyalty from theft in a woman who cannot even sign her own work. I think, she said, that I have already distinguished it. 18 times over. She had not meant to say so much. She saw the words land in him, saw him search her face for whatever they might mean, and she gave him nothing further, only the same composed stillness she had worn through 6 years of unsigned ledgers and unspoken corrections. He did not know about the false bottom of her writing desk, 3 rooms distant, where the brown leather spines waited stacked in order, 1808 through 1817, each one carrying her own hand in the margins, like a second, truer signature. He had never once asked to see her private accounts. It had not occurred to him that a woman kept accounts of her own. You will regret this, he said, low, and reached for his hat with a hand that was not quite steady. When he turns the question on you, as he will, remember that I offered you a way out of it, and you refused. I will remember that you offered me a forgery, she said, and called it kindness. He said nothing more. He took up his coat, his hat, the ledger he had brought to plead over, and went out into the rain without troubling to close the door behind him, so that the cold came in across the flagstones, and the candle guttered once, sharply, before steadying. She sat a long while listening to his footsteps recede across the gravel, then to the creak of the stable-yard gate, then to nothing at all but the rain. Only then did she rise, cross to her own desk, and press her palm flat against its worn top, not opening it, not yet, only feeling the shape of what waited beneath, patient as it had been for years, as though the wood itself understood that morning would ask a question the steward could no longer answer for her. She woke before the house did, while the sky was still the color of pewter and the frost had not yet surrendered to the sun. She dressed in her plainest wool, took up her father's old chain and his brass-cased compass, both kept wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her trunk these 8 years, and went out through the kitchen garden gate before even the boot boy was stirring. The western coppice lay a mile off, past the stable-yard and the low stone bridge, and the walking warmed her before the thinking did. She had not gone among the trees in years. There had been no cause, her work being confined to columns and totals, to the steward's careless dictation. But she remembered enough of what her father had taught her to know that a stump does not lie the way a ledger can be made to. She counted first, then she counted again, because the number displeased her, and a third time because she did not trust displeasure to be accuracy. The coppice had been cut in rotations, as coppices are, a portion each year so that the wood renewed itself and gave a steady yield rather than a ruinous one. Her father had shown her once, on a neighboring estate, how to read a stand's age by the girth of the new growth ringing each stump, how a well-managed wood told its own history in wood and shadow if a person only troubled to kneel and look. She knelt now in the wet leaf mold and looked. The stumps from the year just past were fewer than the ledger's felling count allowed for by a full third. She measured the girth of the coppice growth against what her father's method predicted for regrowth of that age, and the sums would not answer. She went further in, to the older cuttings, the ones 5 and 6 years gone, and found the same falling short repeated, patient and consistent, as though someone had long ago settled on a fraction to skim and skimmed it every season since, confident that no one would ever kneel in the frost to count. Not months, then, years. She sat back on her heels with the compass cold in her palm, and felt something close to grief, though for what, precisely, she could not have said. Not for the trees, which had after all been felled honestly enough in their felling, only lied about afterward in ink. Not for the steward, who deserved no grief from her. Perhaps only for the 10 years in which no one had walked out here at first light to ask the wood what it knew. She rose, brushed the leaf mold from her skirts, and began the walk back with the figures already arranging themselves in her mind into a shape she would need paper to hold. The house was waking as she crossed the bridge, smoke rising thin from the kitchen chimney, a dog barking somewhere near the stables, and she quickened her step because the coppice had answered her question, and now the ledgers would have to answer it again, in ink, before anyone else could deny it. She did not go directly to the counting house, though every practical instinct told her the figures wanted paper and ink before they cooled in her memory. Instead, she found herself pausing at the edge of the walled kitchen garden, where the frost still silvered the cabbage leaves, and she thought, not for the first time this week, but more sharply now than before, of a morning some 20 years gone, when a much smaller version of herself had knelt in a different frost beside a man in a brown coat who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool. Her father had never called it teaching. He had called it looking properly. He would crouch at the edge of a field he had been hired to survey, unroll his chain, and say, without turning his head, "Tell me what the ground tells you." She had learned to read a hedgerow the way other children learned their letters, this one older than that one by the girth of its oaks, this ditch dug in a drier year than the one beside it, the whole silent history of a boundary laid bare to anyone patient enough to kneel and ask it questions instead of assuming answers. At night he had let her sit at his elbow while he entered his figures into ledgers bound in the same cracked brown leather she now kept hidden in her own desk. Perhaps that was no accident of taste, she thought, but she did not linger on the thought. He had shown her how a column that balanced too neatly, too conveniently, should be trusted less than one with an honest, awkward remainder. Numbers do not flatter a man. He had told her once, not unkindly, when she had asked why he distrusted a client's own account of his acreage. Only men flatter men. Figures only tell you what they are given, and then hold to it stubbornly, whatever is said afterward. He had died when she was 20, of a fever that took him in a fortnight, leaving her his instruments, his few books, and no money at all, a surveyor's daughter, with an education fit for a squire's son, and a fortune fit for a beggar. She had come to Rendell Hall within the year, glad enough of the clerking post, and had told no one, not even the steward in his early, still civil days, that she had learned to read land before she had learned to read novels, or that a column of figures spoke to her with something like a voice. She straightened now, her father 8 years dead and yet standing beside her still, in the particular way she counted a stride or squared a number in her head without thinking. The compass in her pocket was not his, hers was newer, plainer, but her hand had closed around it exactly as his had once closed around its twin, and she carried that inheritance, invisible and unclaimed, across the bridge and into the house, where 18 ledgers waited to be asked, once more, what they knew. The summons came at 4 o'clock, delivered by a footman whose face gave nothing away, though his eyes did, a quick, sideways flick toward the estate office as he spoke, as if he already knew what lay folded inside its drawers, and could not quite believe it would soon be spoken aloud. The steward was to attend his grace in the long gallery within the hour. He was to bring his accounts. Word travels faster in a house than any servant walks. By 4:30 the scullery had heard it, by 5 the stables, and by the appointed hour the long gallery, usually a corridor for portraits and dust, and the occasional dance when the family still gave them, had filled with more bodies than it had seen in a decade. Footmen lined the paneling with the studied blankness of men pretending not to wait for something. The housekeeper stood near the fireplace, arms folded, her mouth set in the particular thinness that meant she was calculating who would come out of the room diminished. Even the cook had come up from below stairs, wiping her hands on her apron as though the gesture might disguise how far she had walked from her proper post to see this. The steward arrived last, and badly. His coat was buttoned wrong at the top, a small thing, but the household noticed it the way a hound notices a limp before it understands the wound. He carried under one arm a single ledger, thin, new-bound, its leather still faintly glossy, the sort of book a man keeps when he wishes to be asked no questions he cannot answer from memory. The Duke was already seated when the doors opened, at the long table beneath the darkest of the family portraits, his cane laid crosswise before him like a boundary line. He did not rise. He did not offer a chair. 10 years of coppice revenue, he said, and you bring one book. The steward began an answer about fires, about a damaged storeroom, about the difficulty of climate on old paper, and the words came quickly, too quickly, spilling over one another the way water spills from a vessel already cracked. The household, listening, understood before the sentence finished that the crack had been there long before today. The Duke let him finish. He always let a man finish. It was, she had noticed watching him these past weeks, one of the few mercies he allowed himself to extend, and one of the more devastating, since it gave the guilty every rope required to hang themselves by their own words. "Bring the clerk," he said at last, to no one in particular, and yet the whole gallery turned, as one body, toward the corridor that led to the estate office, toward the drawer, with the false bottom, and the 18 ledgers waiting inside it, like witnesses who had held their silence a very long time, and had, at last, been called to speak. She did not go at once. She stood a moment in the doorway of the estate office, one hand flat against the cold wood of her own desk, and let the summons settle into her before she answered it, because 6 years had taught her that haste was a luxury afforded only to those who had never been blamed for anything. Then she knelt, worked the small brass catch beneath the drawer's false bottom, and drew out the ledgers one by one, stacking them by year, the cracked brown leather sighing under her palms like something long asleep and reluctant to wake. 18 books, 10 years. £1,940, though she did not yet say the sum aloud even to herself. She carried them in 2 journeys, her arms aching by the second, and set them on the corner of the long table nearest the window, not yet before him, only near, a witness allowed to enter the room, before being called to the stand. It was in that interval, while she arranged the volumes by date, that the steward's voice cracked entirely. It was she, he said, and the gallery went very still, who kept the books, all of it, the entries, the sums, the corrections. I signed what she gave me. If there is fault in the figures, it is her hand that made them, not mine. No one moved. The rival housekeeper's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as though she had bitten back a word she was no longer certain she wished to spend. The footman studied the floor with sudden great interest. Margaret felt the eyes turn to her the way heat turns toward an open door. She did not look up from the ledgers, though her hands, for one instant, went still upon the leather. The Duke had not moved either, but something in his stillness altered, tightened, the way a rope tightens before it either holds or breaks. "Her hand," he repeated, very quietly. "Yes, Your Grace. Every column. I only signed." "You have kept the estate's books yourself for 10 years, the Duke said, "and yet you did not know, until this moment, whether the hand that kept them was honest or false. Is that your defense? It was not a question, and the steward understood, a beat too late, that he had not offered a shield, but had instead named, before the entire household, precisely whose testimony would now be trusted above his own. He opened his mouth again, and found nothing further to put in it. Margaret set the last ledger, 1817, half-filled, ink still dark in its final entries, atop the others, squared the stack with 2 fingers, and only then lifted her eyes to the Duke's. "Bring them here," he said to her, and for the first time in 6 years, the room waited to hear what her own voice would say. She came around the desk with the stack held against her body, the way a woman carries a child she does not yet trust the room to be gentle with, and set the 18 volumes before him in the order the years had made them, 1808 uppermost by weight of habit, though she reversed it without thinking, so that the earliest lay first, and the half-finished current year lay last, ink still wet enough in places to catch the light from the window, and hold it like a wound freshly opened. The Duke did not touch them at once. He looked instead at her hands, which had gone still again now that their errand was finished, and then at her face, which had arranged itself into the same composed blankness she had worn for 6 years behind the steward's shoulder, the face of a woman who had long ago decided that safety lay in being unremarkable. "You will account for yourself," he said, "not the ledgers, you." The room, which had been holding its breath for the steward's ruin, now held it for hers. She understood the distinction he was drawing, and understood, too, that it was not cruelty, but precision, the same precision with which he had dismantled the steward a moment before, turned now upon her like a lamp swung round to a second face in the dark. He was not asking whether the figures were true. He was asking why a woman who had known, for a decade, that timber revenue vanished from the western coppices at a rate no honest steward could explain, had said nothing to anyone who might have stopped it. "I was not asked, Your Grace," she said, "and had I spoken, I would not have been believed over him. I kept the true accounts, because someone had to, and I marked them in the margins, because I would not let the truth vanish along with the money, even if I could not yet say it aloud. You could have gone to the magistrate." "With what standing?" "I am a clerk's shadow, sir, by the house's own naming. A woman's word against a steward of 10 years is no word at all. I have watched better claims than mine dismissed at this very desk." He was silent at that, and the silence had weight, the particular weight of a man recalculating a sum he had thought already closed. Behind her she heard the housekeeper's breath catch and release, and somewhere further off, near the door, the low creak of a boot shifting as a footman leaned to hear better. "Then why keep the truth at all," the Duke said, "if you meant never to speak it?" She looked at him then, fully, for the first time since he had entered the room that morning, and something in her plain composure did not break so much as open a fraction, like a ledger's spine long pressed shut. "Because someone would ask, one day," she said. "I did not know it would be you." The Duke did not press her further. He stood instead, the cane finding the floor with its habitual small sound, and looked at her, the way a man looks at a ledger, whose total he suspects, but has not yet verified. "An hour," she said. "Give me an hour, sir, and I will not ask you to take my word for anything." He inclined his head, once, and she understood it for the assent it was. She went out through the long gallery rather than the hall, because the hall would have meant passing the housekeeper's raised eyebrow, and she had no strength to spare for it. The counting-house smelled as it always did in the cold months, tallow and dust, and the particular staleness of a room where no fire had been lit before 9. She knelt at her own desk, the desk she had sat at for 6 years while another man's name went above the columns she wrote, and worked the false bottom free with the flat of a letter knife, as she had done perhaps 400 times before, though never once with anyone waiting to see the result. The ledgers came up in their cracked brown leather, 18 of them, each thinner than a Bible and heavier, somehow, for what it held. She did not stack them, she carried them 2 at a time, because more than that strained her arms, and she would not be seen dropping one on the flagstones, like a girl overburdened with laundry. 4 trips, 4 times across the gallery, past the cold hearth, past the portrait of the old Duke, whose eyes had watched her for years, without ever once asking what she knew. On the third trip she passed the housekeeper in the corridor, who did not mock her this time, only stepped aside and watched the ledgers pass, as though they were a coffin being carried to its rest. By the fourth trip her arms ached properly, a dull burn from wrist to shoulder, and she was grateful for it. It gave her something to feel that was not the Duke's question still turning over in her chest. Then why keep the truth at all, if you meant never to speak it? She had given him an answer. It had not felt like enough, even as she said it. In the estate office, she laid them across the desk in order, 1808 through 1817, the two partial years bracketing the rest like bookends, and stood back to look at what 10 years made when set down side by side. A low brown wall of them, spines cracked white along the fold, corners softened by handling no one had known she'd given them. She heard his cane before she heard the door. "An hour," he said, "was generous of you to ask for. You have used 40 minutes. "I have used what I needed," she said, and did not turn from the desk. "The rest, sir, you may take for yourself." He came to stand at the desk's edge, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as though the ledgers themselves required a silence before they could be read properly, the way a congregation waits before the first line of a hymn. She had set them by year and nothing more, no flourish, no commentary, because the arrangement itself was the argument. 10 spines, cracked white along the fold, 2 thinner ones bracketing the rest, the partial years, 1808 trailing off mid-autumn, and 1817 beginning only in January, as though the estate's dishonesty had needed time to find its rhythm, and time, at the end, to be caught mid-breath. "Begin where you like," she said. "They will tell the same story from either end." He opened 1808 first. She watched his eyes go down the page the way a man reads a letter he suspects will contain bad news, slowly, bracing before each line rather than after it. In the margin beside the third entry for October, in her own hand, small and cramped, as though she had feared the ink itself might be noticed. Coppice sale, recorded 40s, actual receipt unknown, steward present at transaction, self absent. He said nothing. He turned the page. By 1811, the marks grew bolder, dates circled twice, sums subtracted in a neat column she had kept for herself alone, never shown, never spoken of, 6 years of arithmetic, done in the margins of another man's fraud. She had not written. "He is stealing." She had never dared that sentence on paper, but the marks, taken together, said it more plainly than any accusation could have. A decade's testimony assembled one small note at a time, the way a woman might save coins in a jar too narrow to count until it was full. "You annotated all of them," he said. It was not quite a question. "I annotated what I was permitted to see, which was all of it, in the end, since I copied the entries myself." She kept her hands folded before her, though she wanted very much to reach out and turn the page for him, to hurry him toward the sum she already carried whole in her memory. She did not. "You will find the totals differ from what was reported to the trustees, not by chance and not by error." He closed 1808 and set it aside, and opened 1809, and the room filled with the particular sound of old paper turning, dry, papery, patient, while outside the window the light had begun its slow gray climb toward noon, indifferent to what was being uncovered within. "How long," he said, without looking up, "before the sums stop being small?" "Not long," she said. "By 1812, sir, you will want to sit down." He did sit down, though not at once, and not because she had told him to. She turned 1810 toward him so the felling record faced the window's light, and set beside it the merchant's receipt book, a thinner volume, its cover water-stained at one corner from some forgotten spring, and asked him to read the two side by side. 41 oaks marked felled in the western coppice that March. 36 sold, by the merchant's own hand, at the going Michaelmas price. She did not say the word theft. She let the arithmetic say it, the way her father had taught her the land itself would confess its slope to anyone patient enough to walk it twice. 5 trees, the colonel said. 5 trees in March alone. There are other marches. She showed him April of the same year, and then September, and each time the pattern repeated with the small variations of a man clever enough not to be greedy in the same way twice. Sometimes trees miscounted, sometimes miscounted at the sale. The difference banked in the gap between what the coppice gave and what the ledger of record admitted receiving. In the margin beside each entry, in her own hand, small and cramped and dated, sat the correction she had made and never been thanked for, and beside it, smaller still, the note she had never been permitted to send upstairs. You marked it at the time. I marked it because I could not stop myself from being accurate, sir. It is a fault in me. She turned another page. I was not asked to be honest. I was asked to be quiet. He did not answer that. He bent instead over 1812, and here the numbers thickened, the false entries no longer occasional, but woven through nearly every quarter, brazen in a way that suggested the steward had grown confident, or careless, or both, and she watched the colonel's jaw work as the sum beneath her penciled totals climbed past what any single year's rents could excuse. Outside, the fog that had sat low over the western coppice since dawn was lifting at last, and through the window she could see, faintly, the pale shapes of stumps emerging along the tree line where whole stands should still have stood dark and full, as though the land itself had chosen this morning to stop keeping the secret too. Column by column, he said quietly, more to the ledger than to her. Column by column, she agreed. It does not announce itself all at once. That is why no one saw it for 10 years. It only ever shows you one tree at a time. He turned to 1813, and his hand, she noticed, had gone very still upon the page. 1813 gave way to 1814, with the same patient cruelty, and by then she had stopped watching his face and begun watching only his hand, because the hand told her more than the face ever would, the way it paused at each entry, the way the fingers pressed a moment too long against the page, as if pressing might change what was written there. "Read it to me," he said, "the whole of it, year by year." She had known this request would come. She had, in some quiet corner of herself, prepared for it these 6 years, without knowing she was preparing. 1808 into 09, she said, £112, 4 shillings, unaccounted from the coppice felling. She turned the page. 09 into 10, £90 even. He grew careless with the shillings that year, or perhaps only greedy. She did not look up. 1810, £131. 1811, 144. 1812. And here her voice did not change, though the sum did. £203, 6 shillings, the worst single year of the 10. He said nothing. The fire had burned low, and no one had thought to mend it. 1813, £189. 1814, 197. 1815. She paused only long enough to turn the ledger, not long enough to be mistaken for hesitation. £211, the year your uncle's health first failed, when no one thought to look too closely at anything. She heard him draw breath at that, though he did not speak. 1816, £178. 1817, to the quarter just past, 181. She set the last ledger down atop the others, squaring its edge against the desk, with the same small precision she had given every column for 6 years. £1,940, she said, across 10 years, to the shilling. The number sat in the room the way smoke sits after a candle is snuffed, visible a moment longer than it ought to be, refusing to disperse. He did not ask her to repeat it. He did not need to. She watched him understand that she could have recited it in her sleep, that she had perhaps done exactly that on some nights, turning the sum over the way other women turned over grievances they were permitted to voice aloud. "Nearly £2,000, he said at last, very low, taken 100 at a time, so that no single year would ring loud enough to be heard. Yes, and you heard it anyway." "I had no choice but to hear it," she said. "I was the one who wrote it down." Outside, the last of the fog had gone from the coppice entirely, and the stumps stood plain and pale in the gray morning light, uncounted no longer. The steward had been silent through the reading of the sum, but silence, she had learned across 6 years of watching him, was never his surrender, only the interval before his next evasion. He straightened, tugging at his waistcoat, as though the garment itself might restore some authority to him. "Figures may be arranged to say a great many things," he said. "A column can be made to look like theft by a clever enough hand. I have long suspected hers of being exactly that sort of hand." "Then you will not object," she said, "to the entry for October of 1813. She did not raise her voice. She opened the 7th ledger to a page already marked with a strip of ribbon, worn soft from handling, and turned it toward him rather than toward the Duke, which seemed to unsettle him more than if she had turned it toward his master directly. £40, paid to Hartley the timber merchant for coppice clearing, she read, your signature beside it, and beside your signature, the hour. You were most particular, always, that the hour be noted, so that no clerk might claim confusion over which delivery a payment concerned. 3:30, by your own pocket watch, you wrote here. She let a breath pass. Hartley's own receipt book, which I copied in the winter of that year, against the possibility that I would one day need it, records the same delivery at 4:30. An hour later, a different cart. A different quantity, £11 less than what you entered here. The steward opened his mouth. Nothing satisfactory arrived to fill it. An hour is a small thing to dispute, he managed at last, and even he seemed to hear how small the words had become in his own mouth. An hour was all I needed, she said. You taught me that yourself, sir, though you did not mean to. You were always most exact about the time. It was the sums you grew careless with. Something in his face gave way then, not gradually, as she had half expected after years of watching him maintain his composure over lesser accusations, but all at once, like a retaining wall long undermined by water, finally admitting the water had won. His shoulders dropped. The color that had been rising in his throat drained from it. He looked, for the first time in her memory of him, like a man rather than an office. The Duke had not moved from where he stood beside the desk, one hand still resting on the head of his cane, and it was into that stillness that the steward's silence finally settled. No longer strategy, only exhaustion, only the arithmetic of a decade finally closing itself around him, with nowhere left to run. The Duke let the silence hold a moment longer than was comfortable, as though testing whether the steward would fill it again with some further scrap of defense. He did not. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, a man emptied of argument, and the only sound in the counting-house was the small tick of the clock on the mantel and the rasp of his own breathing. Unsteady now, the breathing of a man who has run some great distance and only just realized it. You will leave Rendell Hall by nightfall, the Duke said. He did not raise his voice to say it. That, she would think later, was the cruelest part of the sentence. That it required no volume at all, that 10 years could be ended in a register scarcely above conversation. He spoke the way he might have given an order on a field she could not picture, brief, final, expecting no debate, because none was owed him. Your effects will be gathered by the housekeeper and sent after you within the week, to whatever direction you provide her. You will not return to these grounds, nor to the tenants, nor to the coppices. If you are found upon Rendell land after tonight, I will treat it as trespass, and I will treat it without patience. Whatever had been rising in him, some last reflexive plea, some appeal to years of service, to a wife perhaps, to a name once respectable in the village, did not survive the Duke's face, which offered nothing to appeal to. He closed his mouth again. He looked, briefly, toward her, not with the old contempt, not even with anger, but with something closer to bewilderment, as though only now, in the last minute allowed him, did he understand what he had failed to see in 6 years of dismissing her. Then he looked away and did not look back. He gathered his hat from the stand by the door with hands that fumbled twice at the brim before finding purchase. He did not ask for the ledgers. He did not ask for anything. He went out through the counting-house door into the gray forecourt light, and she heard his footsteps on the gravel, unhurried at first, and then quicker, as a man's steps quicken, who wants suddenly to be anywhere else than where he has just stood. The Duke did not watch him go. He had already turned back toward the desk, toward the 18 ledgers still open across its surface, their cracked spines catching the thin morning light, and toward her. as though the steward had already ceased to be a matter requiring further attention, and something else, still unspoken, remained. The quiet that followed had a texture to it, thick as the dust that had settled on the ledger's spines for years before anyone thought to open them. She did not move to close the books. She stood with her hands folded before her, the posture of a woman accustomed to waiting to be told whether she might speak, though she had already spoken more plainly than words that morning, in 18 volumes of her own hand. The Duke did not sit. He remained standing at the desk's edge, one hand braced against its surface. The cane leaned against his hip in a way that suggested he had, for the moment, forgotten he needed it. He looked down at the columns once more, the Western Coppice entries, the discrepancies bracketed in her small, careful marks, and then he looked up, not at her, but past her, to where the housekeeper stood in the doorway with the others, her sharp face for once, without its habitual scorn. "Who kept these?" he said. It was not quite a question. Truly kept them, not the man who signed them. No one answered at first. The clerks by the window shifted their weight. The steward's absence still hung in the room like smoke after a door has been shut against a draught. It was the housekeeper who spoke. "She did, Your Grace." Her voice was steady, stripped of the mockery it had carried for years toward the plain wool dress, the ink-stained fingers, the woman she had once called nothing more than a shadow. 6 years, by my reckoning, perhaps longer. She corrected his sums before he ever saw them wrong. The Duke's eyes moved to her then, properly, for the first time since the steward had gone out into the gravel yard. Something in his expression was not quite surprise, for he had already seen the ledgers, already seen the hand in the margins matching across a decade of entries, but there was, in the set of his mouth, an acknowledgement that the housekeeper's words had confirmed what the numbers alone could not, that others had known, had watched, had said nothing until this hour allowed them to. The housekeeper did not look at her when she spoke, but afterward, in the half-second before she lowered her eyes, something passed between them that had not passed in 6 years. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of it, the way frost begins to loosen at the edges of a window before the sun has properly risen. The Duke said nothing for a long moment. He looked once more at the open ledgers, then drew the 18th toward him, the one that carried the year still unfinished, and set his palm flat upon its cover, as though weighing something he had not yet decided how to say aloud. 6 years, he said at last, and though his voice did not rise, it carried the particular weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed without repetition, is a long time to keep a silence one was never asked to keep. He did not look at the housekeeper when he said it, nor at the empty doorway through which the steward had gone, still protesting, still gesturing at the gravel, as though the drive itself might rise up in his defense. He looked instead at the ledgers, all 18 of them, cracked brown spines catching the gray morning light through the counting-house window, and at the hand that had annotated every one, small, exact, unhurried, a hand that had corrected what it was forbidden to report, and had gone on correcting it anyway, year after year, because the columns demanded truth, even when the household did not. The staff had gathered by then in the corridor beyond the open door, the stable boy, the under-footman, 2 of the maids still in their morning aprons, drawn by the noise of the steward's departure, and remaining for what came after, as servants do, sensing before they are told that something in the order of the house has shifted beneath their feet. The Duke did not send them away. He seemed, in fact, to want them there, as though the words he was about to speak required witnesses in the same way the theft had required a ledger, proof that could not later be disputed or softened into rumor. "The office of steward," he said, "is vacant." He let that settle a moment, his cane tapping once against the floorboards, the only sound besides the fire's low collapse in the grate. "It will not be filled by another man brought in to sign what he has not earned and cannot account for." He turned then, fully, to where she stood beside the desk that had hidden its false-bottomed drawer for a decade. "Rendell Hall will have an estate manager. I am naming her now, before you all, so there is no whisper afterward that it was done in a corner." The housekeeper's chin lifted, then lowered, and when she moved, a small step forward, a bend of the knee that had never once, in 6 years, been offered to the woman she had called the steward's shadow, the corridor seemed to hold its breath along with her. It was not a deep curtsy, nor a long one, but it was correctly made, the kind given to those whose authority is not questioned, and when she rose, her eyes met the new estate manager's for the length of a single heartbeat before dropping, properly, to the floor. The Duke watched this exchange without comment, though something in the line of his jaw eased, very slightly, as a man's does when a debt long overdue is at last, imperfectly, repaid. Then he drew the ledger of record across the desk and reached for the pen. The pen was old, the nib slightly split, and it left a small blot before the first stroke of her name, which she did not try to hide. She had imagined this moment for 6 years without permitting herself to imagine it too clearly, and now that it had come, she found it smaller than expected and larger than she could hold. A plain page, a plain ink, and her own hand moving across it as though it had always belonged there. She wrote her name in full, not the initials she had used in margins for a decade, not the small corrective marks that no one but the steward had ever been meant to see, but her whole name, in the same steady hand that had balanced 18 years of another man's dishonesty. The Duke watched the ink dry without speaking, and there was a courtesy in his silence that she understood better than any praise he might have offered. That had been in the cold of early spring. By midsummer, the western coppice bore new growth in careful rows, replanted under her own direction, with saplings bought at fair price, and entered, this time, at their true cost. The books that autumn balanced to the shilling, as they had not balanced in 10 years, and when the quarter's accounts were closed, she found she no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps behind her at the desk. The housekeeper, in those months, had become something quieter than an enemy and not yet a friend, a woman who brought her tea, without being asked, and corrected the maid's curtsies toward her, with a briskness that was its own kind of loyalty. Neither of them spoke of the years before. There seemed no need. On the morning she closed the last ledger of that first full year under her own name, the Duke came to the office door and stood there a moment, his cane against the frame, watching her blot the final entry with the same economy of motion her father had once shown over a surveyor's chain. "The figures hold," she said, not looking up. "They generally do, when you keep them." He said nothing further. He did not need to. He lingered at the threshold a moment longer than the occasion required, long enough that she felt it, though she did not raise her eyes to confirm it, and then he said only, "Carry on," and was gone down the corridor, his uneven step fading into the ordinary sounds of the house, a door, a distant bell, the scratch of her own pen resuming its work. She had waited 6 years to be named. She found, in the end, that being trusted mattered rather more.